never stop standing up for this. Hello, I'm Regina Lux. You're watching Veritas in the Rocks, and welcome to my pretty little soapbox. Oh, I swear, Jesus, please don't let any of these giant bugs fly into my whiskey. It's hard to know your purpose when you don't know what your worth is. That's extremely true. And not just because it answers the big questions in life, like, why am I here? Or why should I continue living at all? But because knowledge of our worth moves us in our everyday small tasks. It gives us reason in even the smallest things that we do. Knowing your purpose gives you meaning to what you do with your time. When we have a clear vision of who we are and why we matter, our purpose in life seems so much clearer. We move along happier and more satisfied, no matter what life throws at us. Knowing your worth is so key to knowing your purpose. We form a lot of our self-concept based on how other people treat us. Generally, people are selfish and treat other people like commodities. I spoke about this in my Children Are Not Accessories video. We are used and discarded on the whims of others, and we ourselves are not blameless because in some measure we do it to others as well. So many in our society have abandoned science and morals to define the worth of a human being, and instead have embraced facts driven by emotionalism and a survival of the fittest mentality. Our society is overloaded with suicide and anti-bullying awareness, and yet we're all more depressed than ever. While gratefulness is the root of happiness, people generally aren't happy because they don't know their own value. They don't know how to find their own value, and society gives a lot of mixed messages about what should define your self-worth. When I was 13, I was spoken to highly suggestively for the first time by a boy my age who I thought was very Christian. I was devastated. I felt dirty and gross, and what was worse, I felt worthless. I felt reduced to an object. I had been. Although I was bullied throughout all my childhood and would be bullied well into my teen years, this one instance stood out to me so vividly, and it affected me so greatly. I was affected more by this instance than many others. Why? It's one thing to be bullied because you aren't well liked for who you are. It's another thing to have who you are completely stripped away and to be looked at for the bare minimum gratification you could offer someone else. I vividly remember the aftermath of this encounter. I was sitting on the carpet in the middle of my room, shaking and crying, and I was terrified to tell anyone what had happened because I figured it would be blown off and I would be told it was no big deal and I would be mocked and made to feel even worse. People would just say, it's just not that big a deal. But it was a big deal. And it still is a big deal anytime it happens to anyone. It was a big deal, and I knew it. I had been looked upon in a way that denied my self-worth. I searched for some kind of coping mechanism and decided to reach into a drawer and pull out a notebook and write something to myself to look back and reflect on whenever this happened in the future. I wrote this ultra-analytical examination of why this happened to me and how I should deal with it in the future. I wrote to myself how I need to move forward and accept that this is my reality now. I wrote down questions to ask myself, including, how does this actually make me worth less? What did I figure out about this person? And what do I plan on doing in the future to guard myself? I wasn't even high school age yet. When you're bullied, the person bullying you isn't hiding from you that they're an awful person. But when someone you trusted to be moral turns out to not value basic morality, there's a sting of deception. It's far more painful to find out that something that you believed was true turned out to be false. And you feel like an idiot for trusting another person in the first place. It's a lot harder to trust after that. Your whole understanding of who you can trust and what you can believe just shatters. That's the core of why clerical abuse is so shocking. We were supposed to trust these people and they failed us. They failed us astronomically. I should note for this next bit that I always looked much older than I was when I was growing up. By the time I was 14, I looked like a 20-year-old. On the morning of my 16th birthday, my mom declared that we would spend the day out together, encountering whatever adventures came our way. I remember picking out a really cute, simple, modest outfit, doing my hair and makeup, and I felt so grown up. I carried myself like I was much older, too. The first place we went was to a gas station to grab coffee. I walked in by myself, and I looked over towards the magazines. In the magazine aisle was a person who had to be at least in his 30s, thumbing through the skin mags. He looked up at me, saw me, looked back down at the magazines, looked up at me again, and smiled, leering. He wouldn't look away from me, and I was overwhelmingly aware of his thoughts, and disgusted doesn't even begin to describe how I felt. He didn't care that I knew he was looking at me. He didn't care that I seemed to be so much younger than him. He didn't seem to care that I hadn't done a single thing worthy of objectification like that. He didn't seem to care that I was a human being worthy of dignity. I don't think he understood what human dignity was. All I knew was that he had just been looking at naked women, and now he was leering at me, picturing me naked. Sweet 16 ruined. After these instances of objectification began happening often, as time went on, I felt more and more worthless. Honestly, if I hadn't been religious, I probably would have been suicidal. Between the bullying and the objectification, it was a colossal emotional task to maneuver myself and pull myself back up, especially since I really didn't have any close friends at the time to rely on, since I was very shy. I became very robotic at a young age because I didn't know how else to handle the emotional aftermath of what was happening to me. I threw myself into doing. I tried to find for myself some value through good Samaritan actions and try to earn value above what other people were currently giving to me. The thing is, you can't earn your value in other people's eyes. Not truly. People decide whether or not someone else, or others generally, have value to them, and that's when they will behave accordingly. It doesn't matter what you do. No one is going to grant you more value based on how many actions you perform. There's no way that any amount of good you do will ever stop some people from treating you terribly. I never earned more worth to anyone else generally. The objectifying only ever became worse as time went on, not just for me, but for all the innocent females around me too. Heck, a couple days ago, I was objectified by a female. She was losing an argument to me in a Facebook group, so she went to my profile and took a bunch of pictures of me and then tried to make the argument that I didn't look like a Christian. I don't know how a Christian was supposed to look. I guess you can only be considered a Christian female if you're a mean, insecure, bitter hag, but none of my photos were risque or showing any skin. A couple of them I was completely covered up, but I was objectified nonetheless in an effort to win some kind of argument. Anyway, I always took pains to avoid being objectified. I never wore a bikini in public, even as a teenager. I never posted entire photo shoots I was in. I would never wear anything risque or shortcut or low cut or anything like that, and I didn't want to give anyone license to treat me like a sexual object. I made these efforts because I didn't want to be defined in a sexual way. I just wanted to be seen as someone who was worthy of basic human value. I ended up putting my Catholic foot forward in an effort to demand respect for my basic human dignity. Oftentimes that backfired. I became an untouchable, a goody-goody that men wanted to corrupt for a power trip. There was even an incident when I was in college where I was ganged up on by a few guys who were fascinated by the fact that I was a virgin because they wanted to fix it. I got away, don't worry. Let's look at why this is even an issue to begin with. Yes, human dignity has been denied throughout all of history. This isn't new. However, it's more rampant now than ever with our technological advances. Years ago, when I taught on the sociological and psychological effects of pornography, it was then that the average age of a child being exposed to pornography was about 7. Children are playing violent video games and learning to score points on how many people they kill. YouTube for Kids has sickos uploading videos telling children how to cut themselves or trying to groom them to be molestation victims. All this has been starting younger and younger. Those who are not sensitive to such depictions of torture and rape tend to have built up a tolerance for it, and possibly, in a lot of cases, a desire for it. Look at our biggest shows on television right now. Look at what's jam-packed into them. Supply and demand. Rapists aren't born. And yes, I know you can make the argument that some people are born mentally ill or with severe personality disorders. I'm excluding people like that for the sake of this argument. People who rape and harm other people have become numb to human suffering and also human dignity. And what's more is they get off on ripping away human dignity from other people. They've become conditioned. There's a reason why the sexy schoolgirl is a cliche. Disordered men desire to corrupt innocence, while emotionally and mentally healthy men desire to preserve it. People argue that they can tell the difference between reality and fantasy, but they are still systematically desensitizing their brain, especially if the conditioning starts at a young age, which it is now. Now let's dive into some hard truths about emotional desensitization. If someone is watching a show and a violent rape scene comes on and they aren't extremely disturbed by it, there's something wrong with them. It usually means that they've seen far worse. So the instance seems so small to them. If they aren't disgusted enough to walk away, or at least stop promoting what they're watching, then that usually means that they've sought out things in equal or harder measure in order to fulfill disordered sexual fantasies. And yes, it is a disordered desire to seek out for entertainment purposes the ripping away of human dignity. It's not normal. It's not what we were made for. A person isn't born thinking that other people have zero value. Even babies are proven to have empathy. No, through seeking out degrading entertainment, you have chosen to systematically desensitize your brain. We choose to train our brain into believing that other people don't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a character or not. We teach ourselves that other people exist for our own pleasures, and that not only does their suffering not matter, it's entertainment. And if someone who identifies as religious chooses to be just moderately upset at the depictions of the devaluing of human dignity, but not enough to disown it or walk away from the overarching depictions, they have a poorly formed conscience. They have learned to ignore the cries and the suffering of their fellow man. They have learned to not only not care, but take it in stride, choosing to ignore it or even embrace it as part of their entertainment. And when someone is greatly affected by something that they watch or people that they hang out with, and then turn around and behave that way towards an innocent female, it starts to really matter. Sexual abuse victims will willingly relive their sexual abuse in an effort to desensitize themselves, to try to teach themselves that what happened to them was no big deal. Or they'll take on the role of the abuser in an effort to be the one in the powerful role. I feel for the women who end up in prostitution or porn. The difference between me and them is that I learned where my value came from. And it wasn't from momentary gratification I could provide for someone else. I learned that my worth was not given to me by someone else's sexual desire for me. Yet, I can understand how someone can get used to feeling like they are only worth something after they are granted value after providing momentary gratification. People have become so desperate for feeling valuable that they devalue themselves in the process. We live in a society where people don't know their worth, and they urgently and aimlessly seek after validation. But here's the rub. We don't want to take personal responsibility for helping to form those poor self-concepts. We don't want to take responsibility for our own poor choices and actions. So we tell ourselves that it's no big deal and we're not affected that much, and that truth and morals are all relative. Society can't even accept science as a basis for morals anymore, much less religion. Oftentimes, science now is dictated by feelings. Someone's worth as a human being is now dictated by how wanted they were by a specific person the moment they were conceived. People are seen as commodities to be bought or sold, to be discarded on whims. Actresses who have to perform sexual acts on bigwigs in order to get parts because they're so desperate to be known, to be forced to have sex on camera, ripping away their human dignity because it furthers a story and it sells, because society buys it. What's left is a society of people being told they have to earn their value, and their value is dependent on their worth to the fitter. And what's left is the mass desensitization to the worth of the human person. People's claws really come out to defend their sins. And as stated, people don't want to take the personal responsibility owed them for continuing to push a distorted social narrative. They downplay their immoral attitudes and actions in order to convince themselves and others that they are not affected by what they put before them or the things that they say. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? They aren't affected. It's wildly prideful for a Christian to claim that they aren't affected by something that would affect a non-Christian more, because that's a false claim to moral superiority. We live in a world where somehow people say that watching naked people have sex isn't pornography, where they watch torture and rape scenes while munching on popcorn. They require the use of moral abstractions in order to defend themselves, but it all comes down to one thing. Does what you seek out in your entertainment and how you treat other people affirm human dignity or diminish it? It's an extremely simple answer these people don't want to face, and it's why their claws come out so angrily to defend themselves and make excuses for themselves. It's why those who know the answer and heed it, taking pains to avoid such things, lose all respect for those people who claim to be moral, but see no fault in what they support or partake in. The cold, hard truth is that people watch things that rip away other people's human dignity because they enjoy it. The truth is that partaking in depictions of horrors against human dignity has been so normalized in our society that a 13-year-old boy thinks it's okay to speak suggestively to a girl. A man in his 30s thinks it's okay to lust after a 16-year-old, and a gang of guys decide it's okay to make rape threats to a woman simply because she's a virgin. If you take nothing else from this video, take this. When you do not stand up and openly reject the devaluing of human beings, you only further desensitize yourself and society, which directly affects individuals. Remember, you must defend the innocent. If you want to make a difference in the life of others, then show them their undeniable human value. Undermine the notion that people are only worth anything if they're hot enough to inspire lustful thoughts. Challenge the idea that people are commodities who ought to be bought and sold according to the desire of the fitter. Defend the mother who has post-abortive syndrome from those who beat her down and call her a murderer and tell her she doesn't deserve to live. Object the notion that someone else's rights hinge on their sexual preferences. Deny the idea that someone else's value relies on their feelings about their body or how they wish they could change it. Stand against desensitization to human suffering. Acknowledge the fact that we can't earn our worth, that is given to us by God at our conception. When you find out your worth, you will find your purpose, and that is what will make you happy and grateful. And be a champion for that very basic veritas.